Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai C.G. Part 3, Chapter 14. The village headman's return put a temporary halt to Luo's daily pilgrimages. Neither the privilege of attending the party conference nor his month of high life in town seemed to have given our headman much satisfaction. He had an aggrieved look, and his cheeks were swollen, his face contorted with rage as he fulminated against one of the revolutionary doctors at the district hospital. Son of a bitch, idiot barefoot doctor pulled out a good tooth and left the bad one, which was next to it. He was particularly furious that the hemorrhage following the extraction of the unoffending molar had prevented him from expressing his outrage, reduced as he was to garbling in a barely intelligible manner. He displayed the evidence of the operation to anyone who expressed the slightest sympathy for his misfortune. A blackened stump with a long pointed yellow root, which he kept carefully wrapped in a square of red silk he had bought at a fair in Yongjing. The least sign of slackness was enough to incense him at this time. So for a while Luo and I set off dutifully each morning to work in the fields. We didn't even risk changing the time on our little magic alarm clock. One evening the headman, still suffering from toothache, turned up at our house while we were cooking supper. He unfolded the square of red silk in which he kept his tooth and held up a small lump of metal. "This is pure tin, which I bought from a traveling salesman," he told us. "Hold it over a flame and it'll melt in 15 minutes. Neither of us said anything. We were too busy suppressing our laughter at his exaggeratedly swollen cheeks. He could have walked straight out of a bad comic film. "My dear Luo," the headman said in an unfamiliar wheedling tone, "I'm sure you must have seen your father do it 1,000 times. Once the tin is malleable, all you need to do is stuff a small quantity into the rotten tooth so that it kills the worms. Isn't that right? You should know about these things, being the son of a well-known dentist. I'm counting on you to fix my tooth." "Are you serious? Do you want me to stopper your tooth with tin?" "Yes, I am. And if the pain goes away, I'll give you a month off from work." This was a tempting prospect, but Luo felt obliged to dissuade him. "Tin alone won't work," he said. "Besides, my father used modern equipment. He'd take a little electric drill and bore into the tooth to start with before putting any filler in." The headman thought this over. He got up and left, muttering to himself, "He's right. I saw them doing that at the district hospital. The cretin who pulled my good tooth also had a sort of thick needle whirring round and buzzing like a motor." A few days later, our headman's suffering was eclipsed by the arrival of little Seamstress' father. The morning sunlight glinted off his shiny sewing machine, which was carried aloft on the naked shoulders of a porter. His annual visit to our village had been postponed several times, and it was unclear whether the delay was due to a surfeit of work or a haphazard attitude to his schedule. At all events, the villagers, to whom his arrival signaled happy times, were delighted to see the sinewy little man show up with his sparkling sewing machine, just a few weeks before the new year. As was his custom when he made his tour of the villages, he had left his daughter at home. We had first set eyes on him on the narrow, slippery footpath. He'd been in a sedan chair because of the rain and the mud. This time, however, the weather was sunny and he was traveling on foot, with a youthful energy that belied his years. He wore a faded green cap, no doubt the very same cap his daughter had lent me for our visit to the old miller, a loose-fitting blue jacket over a beige linen shirt with traditional frog fastening, and a glossy black belt made of genuine leather. The whole village ran out to welcome him. The whoops of the children, the happy cries of the women shaking out lengths of material that had been stashed away for months, the occasional explosion of a leftover firecracker, and the excited grunts of the village swine all combined to create a festive atmosphere. He was mobbed by families pressing invitations on him, all hoping to be the first customer in line. But to everyone's profound astonishment, the old tailor declared, "I will lodge with my daughter's young friends." We wondered what the hidden reason for this choice could be. The most likely explanation, we thought, was that he wanted to find out more about the young man who was his potential son-in-law. But whatever his motives, his transformation of our house on stilts into a tailor's workshop meant that we bore witness to scenes of feminine intimacy such as we had never seen before. It was an ongoing festival of almost anarchic proportions, with girls and women of all ages, plain ones and pretty ones, well off and poor, vying with each other over the fabrics, the lace trimmings, ribbons, buttons, even the sewing thread of their dream wardrobes. Watching them during fittings, Luo and I were amazed to see how agitated they were, how impatient, how physical their desire for new clothes was. It would evidently take more than a political regime, more than dire poverty to stop a woman from wanting to be well dressed. It was a desire as old as the world, as old as the desire for children. Towards evening, all the eggs, meat, vegetables, and fruit that the villagers had presented to the old tailor, like so many offerings, were piled up in a corner of the room, and the men came to join the crowd of women. The more timid ones sat by the fire, their bare heads bowed, cutting their hard toenails with curved knives. They hardly dared look at the girls. Other men, who more experienced and more boisterous, joked with the women and made them obscene propositions. The old tailor's authority was sorely tried until, having grown weary and irritable, he ordered them out of the house. The three of us had a quiet meal together, in the course of which we laughed at the memory of our first encounter on the mountain path. After our amicable supper, I proposed entertaining our guests with some violin music before we all went to bed. His eyelids were drooping, and he declined the offer. "Why don't you tell me a story instead?" he said, opening his mouth wide in a protracted yawn. "The pair of you are excellent storytellers, so my daughter says, which is why I insisted on staying in your house." It could have been because the mountain tailor was clearly tired, or because Luo didn't want his prospective father-in-law to think him too forward, but he seemed to think it was better if I did the honors. "Go on," he said encouragingly. "Tell us something I haven't heard before." It was with some reluctance that I agreed to take the role of bedtime storyteller, and before embarking on my tale, I took the precaution of inviting my listeners to wash their feet with warm water and to slip under the covers in case they fell asleep before I finished. We got out 2 clean quilts and tucked our guest into Luo's bed. The two of us then squeezed into mine together. It was time to begin. I extinguished the oil lamp to save on fuel, and, listening to the tailor's yawns grow louder and lengthier, I lay back with my head on my pillow, closed my eyes, and waited for the opening words to come out of my mouth. I would most certainly have opted for the story of a Chinese or North Korean film, or even an Albanian one, had I tasted the forbidden fruit of Four Eyes' secret suitcase. Had I not. As it was, the stark proletarian realism of those stories, which had represented the sum total of my cultural education until a short while ago, struck me as being so far removed from human desires and true emotions, in short, from real life, that there seemed little point in bothering with them at this late hour. Suddenly, the novel I had just finished reading flashed across my mind. I was confident that Luo had not yet read it. He was still completely wrapped up in Balzac. I slid out from under the covers and sat at the foot of the bed, pondering the most difficult, delicate task: how to phrase my opening line. I wanted to set the tone with something straightforward and arresting. "It is 1815, and we are in the Marseillaise." My voice rang out in the inky blackness of the room. "Where's Marseillaise?" the tailor interrupted sleepily. "On the other side of the world. It's a major port in France." "Why do you want to take us so far away?" "I was going to tell you about a story about a French sailor. If the idea doesn't appeal to you, perhaps it would be better if we all just rest now. Have a good night." In the dark, Luo bent over and whispered softly, "Well done." 1 or 2 minutes later, I heard the tailor once more. "What was your French sailor's name again?" "He started out as Edmond Dantes, but later on he became the Count of Monte Cristo." "Cristo?" "It's another name for Jesus, and it means the Messiah or Savior." And so I began to tell the story of Alexandre Dumas' novel. Luo interrupted me from time to time in a low voice, offering brief, intelligent comments. His enjoyment encouraged me, and soon the self-consciousness induced by my presence, the presence of our guest, fell away. As for the tailor, he was not only weary after a hard day's work, but also overwhelmed, no doubt, by all the foreign names and faraway places I mentioned. He didn't say another word. For all I knew, he was fast asleep. The artistry of the great Dumas was so compelling that I forgot all about our guest, and the words poured from me. My sentences became more precise, more concrete, more compact as I went along. I succeeded with some effort in sustaining the spare tone of the opening sentence. It was not an easy undertaking, but I was pleasantly surprised, in the course of telling the story, to see the narrative mechanism laid bare before my eyes, how Dumas established the theme of vengeance and set out the different storylines which he would eventually gather together with a firm, deft, and audacious hand. It was like seeing a great uprooted tree, the nobility of its trunk, the grandeur of its branches, the strength of its naked roots. I lost all sense of time. How long had I been talking? An hour? 2? We'd arrived at the point in the story where our hero, the French sailor, was locked up in a cell for the next 20 years. I felt drowsy and had to stop. "Right now," Luo whispered to me, "you're doing better than me. You should have been a writer." Intoxicated by this compliment, coming as it did from a master storyteller, I drifted off into a delicious sleep. Suddenly I heard the old tailor's voice rumbling in the dark. "Why did you stop?" "Pardon me?" I exclaimed. "I thought you were asleep." "By no means. I've been listening all the time. I like your story." "I'm too tired to go on." "Well, try to keep it up just a little longer," the old tailor pleaded. "All right, just a little while," I said. "Do you remember where I left off?" "He's been cast into the dungeon of a fortress on an island in the sea." I was impressed by the attentiveness of my elderly listener, and resumed my tale. Every half hour or so I would pause, usually at a cliffhanger, not because I was tired, but because I couldn't resist showing off some tricks of the storyteller's trade. I made him beg me to go on. It was close to daybreak when we reached the part where the abbot reveals the secret of the fabulous treasure hidden on the island of Monte Cristo and helps Edmund to escape from his miserable cell. The gray morning light seeped into the room through the chinks in the walls, to the accompanying twitter and warble of swallows, turtle doves, and finches. At the end of this sleepless night, we all felt exhausted. The tailor had to donate a small sum of money to the village to persuade the headman to give us time off from work. "Have a good rest," the old man said, winking at me, "and make sure you're ready for my next rendezvous with this French sailor." It was the longest story I had ever told, for it took me 9 whole nights to reach the end. It was a mystery to me where the old tailor found the energy to work during the day. Inevitably, some of the details he picked up from the French story started to have a discreet influence on the clothes he was making for the villagers. Dumas would have been most surprised to see the mountain men sporting sailor tops with square collars that flapped in the breeze. You could almost smell the briny Mediterranean air. The blue sailor trousers mentioned by Dumas and copied by his disciple, the old tailor, conquered the girls' hearts with their fluttering bell-bottoms and whiff of the Côte d'Azur. The tailor asked us to draw a 5-pointed anchor, and for several years it became the most popular decorative feature in female fashion on Phoenix Mountain. Some women were so far as to embroider tiny anchors on buttons with gold thread. But there were certain details in Dumas's novel that we kept to ourselves, such as the precise design of the embroidered lilies decorating the corsets and dresses worn by Mercedes. That was a secret we divulged exclusively to the tailor's daughter. The third night of storytelling nearly ended in disaster. It was around 5 in the morning. We were at the very heart of the intrigue, the best part of all, in my view. The Count of Monte Cristo was back in Paris, and thanks to his shrewd manipulations, he had succeeded in approaching his 3 sworn enemies upon whom he sought revenge. One by one, he moved his pawns in a game of diabolical ingenuity. Soon, the prosecutor would be caught in the Count's carefully prepared snare. All of a sudden, just as the Count was about to fall in love with the prosecutor's daughter, a dark, shadowy figure loomed on the threshold, holding a torch. The beam of light put the French Count to flight and brought us rapidly back to reality. It was our village headman, wearing a cap. His swollen face was thrown into grotesque relief by the inky shadows cast on his face in the torchlight. We hadn't even heard his footsteps, so immersed we were in Dumas. "Ah, what good wind has brought you here?" the tailor called out. "I was wondering whether I would have the good fortune to meet you this year. I hear you've been suffering at the hands of our incompetent doctor." The headman did not deign to look at our guest. It was as if he hadn't noticed his presence. He trained his torch at my face. "Anything wrong?" I asked. "Come with me. We're going to have a talk in the public security office at the commune headquarters." Although his toothache prevented him from shouting at me, his mumbling struck fear into my heart. For the name of the security office alone was enough to bring visions of torture and hell for any class enemy. "What for?" I asked, lighting the oil lamp with trembling hands. "You've been spreading reactionary trash. Just as well for our village that I never sleep, and I'm always on guard. I've been here since midnight listening to everything you've been saying, the whole reactionary story of Count What's-His-Name." "It's all right," Luo interjected. "This Count isn't Chinese, you know." "I don't care. One day our revolution will triumph the world over, and anyone who bears the title of Count, regardless of his nationality, is by definition reactionary." "Wait, comrade," Luo said. "You don't know how the story began. Before passing himself off as an aristocrat, the man was a poor sailor, and seamen fall into the category of revolutionary workers. It says so in the little red book." "Don't waste my time with your stupid nonsense," the headman reported. "Have you ever heard of a good man trying to get the better of a public prosecutor?" Saying this, he spat on the floor, a sure sign that he would get violent if I didn't go with him. I crawled out of bed, resigned to my fate, and put on my sturdiest jacket and trousers, like someone preparing for a lengthy sojourn in prison. Emptying the pocket of my shirt, I found some coins, which I handed to Luo so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the security service thugs. Luo threw them on the bed. I'm coming with you," he said. "No, you stay here and take care of things as best you can." I had to fight back my tears as I spoke. The look in Luo's eyes told me that he had understood what I was trying to tell him. To keep the books well hidden in case I broke down under torture. I wasn't sure I would withstand the beatings and floggings that were said to be standard procedure during interrogations at the security office. My legs were shaking as I walked towards the headman. I felt as shaky as when I got into my first fight as a boy. I had lunged at my adversary in a show of bravery, but the shameful trembling of my legs had given me away. The headman's breath smelt of decay. His small eyes, one of them marked, as always, by 3 blood spots, fixed me in a savage stare. For a moment I thought he was going to grab me by the collar and hurl me down the ladder. But he just stood there, rooted to the spot. Finally his eyes left me, rested briefly on the bars of the bed. and then bored into Luo, whom he asked, "You remember the piece of tin I showed you?" "Not very well," Luo replied, puzzled. "The little thing I asked you to stuff into my bad tooth." "Yeah, I remember now." "I still have it," the headman said, taking the red silk parcel out of his coat pocket. "I don't get your meaning," Luo said, still mystified. "If you, the son of a great dentist, can cure my tooth, I'll leave your friend here alone. If not, I'll march him straight to the security office and report him for spreading reactionary filth."